She sold 240 million records. She gave the world a voice so precise, so devastating in its clarity, that it became one of the most recognizable sounds of the 20th century. 5 Grammy Awards, 193 sold-out shows in Las Vegas alone, a performance at the closing ceremony of the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, a song from a film about a ship that sank. And somehow the song outlived the ocean, the wreck, and every version of grief it was supposed to represent. But behind that monument of sound lies a story not glamorous, but terrifying in its silence. A story of a body that began to betray a woman who had built everything she had on what that body could do. A story of 17 years of unexplained symptoms, canceled concerts, and invented excuses, not told out of malice, but out of terror. Because she did not know what was happening. And neither did her doctors, and neither did the world. There were the muscle spasms that began without warning, the progressive rigidity that crept through her torso like something tightening from the inside. The voice, the instrument that had made her one of the most celebrated singers alive, beginning to slip beyond her control in ways that no vocal rest could fix. No vocal coach could explain, no amount of discipline could reverse. And there was the woman behind the legend, standing in front of packed arenas and telling audiences she had the flu, the laryngitis, the exhaustion, because those were the only words she had for something that had no name yet. What do you do when the one thing you were born to do becomes the one thing your body will not let you do? And you cannot explain why? If Céline Dion's voice has ever moved you, if you have ever heard it in a car, or a kitchen, or a quiet room, and felt something break open inside your chest, hit like as tribute to the woman who kept showing up, even when she could not have told you why. It is one of the most extraordinary reversals in the history of popular music. A voice that went silent is returning to the stage, not because the disease is gone, but because the woman holding it refuses to let the disease be the last word. On the 30th of March, 2026, Céline Dion turned 58 years old. And instead of a party, instead of a quiet celebration with her 3 sons in their home in Las Vegas, she gave the world something it had not expected to receive. She sat in front of a camera, and she spoke. The video appeared on her social media accounts without warning. No press release, no carefully staged announcement event, no label strategy. Just Céline, looking directly into the lens and saying the words that millions of people had spent 3 years waiting to hear. She said, "This year, I'm getting the best birthday gift of my life. I'm getting the chance to see you, to perform for you once again." She said she was doing great. She said she was managing her health. She said she felt good and strong and excited. And then she said she was returning to Paris. 10 concerts at the Paris La Défense Arena in September and October of 2026. The pre-sale for tickets opened on the 7th of April, 2026. The shows sold out in a matter of hours. For anyone who had been following Céline Dion's story over the previous 4 years, anyone who had watched the documentary, who had seen the footage, who understood what the diagnosis meant and what it had done to her body, those sold-out shows were not just a commercial event. They were a statement. They were evidence that something had shifted, not a cure. The disease has no cure. But something had shifted enough that the woman who once spent 17 minutes motionless on a rehearsal floor, surrounded by her medical team, unable to breathe normally, had decided she was ready to stand on a stage in front of tens of thousands of people and sing. That decision is not simple. It is not triumphant in any uncomplicated way. It carries the full weight of everything that came before it. The years of silence, the years of invented explanations, the diagnosis that arrived too late to explain the damage already done, and the long, punishing road of treatment that followed. To understand what September 2026 means for Céline Dion, you have to go back, all the way back, to a small town in Quebec, to a family of 14 children, and a kitchen table where music was the only thing that cost nothing and gave back everything. Charlemagne is a small municipality on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River, about 30 kilometers east of Montreal. In 1968, it was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where winters were long and unforgiving, and where a family of 16, 2 parents and 14 children, could exist in a house that was never quite large enough and never quite warm enough, but was always, without exception, full of music. Céline Marie Claudette Dion was born on the 30th of March, 1968. She was the 14th child of Adhémar Dion and Thérèse Tanguay. Her father worked multiple jobs to keep the family fed. Carpenter, store owner, whatever the season required. Her mother was the emotional center of the household, the one who held the noise and the chaos and the hunger together with something that looked, from the outside, like an inexhaustible supply of love and discipline in equal measure. The family was not wealthy. The family was, by any conventional measure, poor. But the Dion household had one resource that cost nothing and produced everything: music. Thérèse Tanguay played music. The older children played music. The family performed together at local events, at small venues, at any gathering that would have them. Music was not a hobby in the Dion home. It was a language, the primary language through which that enormous, crowded, underfunded family communicated something that ordinary words were too small to carry. And into that language, the 14th child was born already fluent. The older siblings would later say that Céline sang before she spoke clearly, that the voice arrived before the words, that there was something in the quality of her sound, even as a very small child, that was different from the ordinary noise of childhood, more precise, more controlled, more present. This is the kind of claim that is easy to dismiss as retrospective mythology, the kind of story families tell themselves about the child who later became famous. But, in the case of Céline Dion, the evidence is unusually consistent. The voice was always there. What it needed was not discovery. What it needed was direction. That direction came in the form of a cassette tape. Céline was 12 years old when she and her mother sat down together and wrote a song. The song was called Ce n'était qu'un rêve. It was only a dream. They recorded it on a cassette, and Thérèse Dion mailed it to René Angelil, a Montreal-based manager who had worked primarily with French-Canadian artists and who had a reputation for recognizing talent before the rest of the industry caught up to it. René Angelil received the cassette. He listened to it, and then he did something that, by any conventional standard of the music business, made very little financial sense. He wept. He would later say that he wept when he heard the voice of that 12-year-old girl. Not out of sentimentality, but out of recognition. He knew, with the particular certainty that comes only to people who have spent decades inside an industry, that he was hearing something that did not come along more than once or twice in a lifetime. He called the family back. He arranged a meeting. And when Céline walked into his office and sang for him in person, whatever remaining doubt he might have carried dissolved entirely. René Angelil was so convinced of what he had heard that he mortgaged his own home to finance the recording of her first album. He was not investing in a child with a pleasant voice. He was betting his house, literally, on the certainty that the world would eventually hear what he heard. The first album was in French. The market was Quebec. The audience was regional. But from the beginning, the ambition was never regional. René Angélil was already thinking beyond Quebec, beyond Canada, beyond French. He was already imagining the version of this story that would eventually reach every corner of the planet. And he was willing to stake everything he owned on his ability to get her there. That willingness, that absolute, financially reckless, emotionally certain conviction, was the foundation on which the entire legend was built. Not by Céline alone. By Céline and the man who heard a cassette tape from a 12-year-old girl and decided, without hesitation, that the world needed to hear it. The relationship between Céline Dion and René Angélil is one of the most examined, most debated, and most persistently misunderstood partnerships in the history of popular music. It began as a business arrangement between a 12-year-old girl with an extraordinary voice and a 40-year-old manager with an extraordinary ear. It became, over the following decade, something that neither of them had planned, and that both of them would spend the rest of their lives defending. Not because the defense was required, but because the world kept demanding it. René Angélil was born on the 16th of January 1942 in Montreal to Syrian-Lebanese immigrant parents. He had been in the music business since his 20s, first as a performer in a group called the Baronets, then as a manager and producer. By the time the cassette tape from Charlemagne arrived on his desk, he had spent 2 decades learning how the industry worked, which promises it kept, which ones it broke, and where the real leverage lived. He was not a naive man. He was not a sentimental man. He was a strategist with a gambler's instinct and a producer's patience. And when he heard Céline Dion's voice for the first time, both the strategist and the gambler in him arrived at exactly the same conclusion. He built her career with meticulous, almost surgical precision. The early French-language albums established her in Quebec. The 1988 Eurovision Song Contest was the first international pivot. Céline represented Switzerland, not Canada, because that was the arrangement that got her onto the European stage. And René Angélil understood that the European stage was a necessary step toward the global one. She performed Ne partez pas sans moi in Dublin. She won. It was not a sentimental victory. It was a calculated one, the kind of victory that opens the next door. The transition to English came in 1990 with the album Unison. René had hired vocal coaches, language coaches, image consultants, everything necessary to transform a French-Canadian girl with a regional audience into an artist capable of competing in the American and British markets. The transformation was total, deliberate, and extraordinarily successful. Unison went platinum. The follow-up albums, Céline Dion in 1992, The Color of My Love in 1993, accelerated the momentum. By the mid-1990s, Céline Dion was not merely successful. She was inescapable. The Power of Love reached #1 in multiple countries. Think Twice spent 7 consecutive weeks at the top of the UK charts. Because You Loved Me became the theme from the film Up Close and Personal, and spent 6 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. And then, in 1997, James Cameron released Titanic. The film ran 3 hours and 14 minutes and became the highest-grossing film in history at the time, earning $1,843 million at the worldwide box office. Its closing theme was My Heart Will Go On, written by James Horner and Will Jennings, performed by Céline Dion. The song won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. It won the Grammy for Record of the Year and Song of the Year. It sold 40 million copies as a single, making it one of the best-selling singles ever recorded. It became so omnipresent, so inescapable, so thoroughly embedded in the cultural fabric of the late 1990s that it outlasted the film that produced it, the decade that hosted it, and every attempt by time to reduce it to nostalgia. Celine had become, by any measurable standard, one of the most successful recording artists in the history of the medium. And René Angélil had built every step of that ascent. Not alone. Celine's voice, her discipline, her ferocious work ethic were irreplaceable. But the architecture of the career, the sequencing of the pivots, the timing of the risks, that was René. It was always René. Which is why what happened between them is impossible to discuss without acknowledging the complexity that surrounds it. The feelings that developed between the manager and his artist were not announced publicly until 1993, when The Color of My Love was released, with liner notes that made the relationship explicit. Céline was 25, René was 51. The 26-year age gap generated immediate and sustained controversy. Commentary about power, about the nature of a relationship that had begun when she was a child and he was her adult manager, about what it meant for a young woman to fall in love with the man who controlled her career. René and Céline addressed the controversy directly and consistently. They said the relationship had not become romantic until Céline was an adult. They said the love was genuine. They said the age difference was irrelevant to the reality of what they shared. They married on the 17th of December, 1994, in a ceremony at the Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal. A wedding so elaborate, so publicly spectacular, that it required Céline to wear a tiara weighing several pounds and produced photographs that circulated around the world. Their first son, René Charles, was born in 2001, after years of fertility treatments that Céline discussed publicly with a candor that was unusual for artists of her stature at the time. Twin boys, Nelson and Eddie, were born in 2010, again after IVF, again after a public journey through the difficulty and uncertainty of that process. René Angélil was diagnosed with throat cancer. He fought it, went into remission, and then the cancer returned. He died on the 14th of January, 2016, 2 days before his 74th birthday. Céline was at his side. 2 days after René died, her brother Daniel Dion died of brain cancer. 2 deaths in 2 days. 2 of the most important men in her life, gone within 48 hours of each other. And Céline Dion, who was also, in ways she did not yet understand, fighting something inside her own body, went back to work. Because the boys needed stability. Because the stage was the only place she had ever known how to process the things that had no other form. Because René had built a career that required her to keep showing up, and she was not yet capable of imagining what it would look like to stop. She did not know, in January of 2016, that the thing happening inside her body already had a name. She would not know that for another 6 years. But the body, it turned out, had been trying to tell her something for much longer than that. The first signs appeared around 2005. They were subtle enough, in the beginning, to be dismissed, or at least deferred. A muscle spasm here, a stiffness that lingered longer than it should have, a sensation in the torso that felt, on certain days, like something tightening from the inside without permission, without cause, without any of the ordinary explanations that a body at the height of physical demand might reasonably produce. Céline Dion was in the middle of one of the most successful residency runs in the history of live entertainment. She was performing at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, in a purpose-built theater that seated 4,000 people per show, in a production that had cost nearly $100 million to construct. The show was called A New Day. It ran from 2003 to 2007 and sold more than 700,000 tickets. The physical demands were extraordinary. The symptoms were easy, at first, to attribute to those demands. But the symptoms did not follow the logic of ordinary physical strain. They did not respond to rest the way exhaustion responds to rest. They did not diminish with the vocal care and physical maintenance that Celine's team applied with the precision of a surgical unit. They shifted and deepened and became harder to explain and harder to hide. The spasms began to affect her ability to control her voice in ways that went beyond what any vocal coach could address. The rigidity began to spread in patterns that did not correspond to any recognizable overuse injury. And the fear, the particular, private, consuming fear of a performer who does not understand what her own body is doing, began to accumulate in the space between the performances that the world saw and the reality that only her inner circle knew. What followed, over the next 17 years, was a sequence of cancellations. Some were small, individual shows, rescheduled dates, the ordinary turbulence of a touring career. Others were larger, entire legs of planned tours, extended pauses, extended silences. And each cancellation required an explanation. Each explanation required a word that Celine and her team could offer to the public in place of the truth. Because the truth was not available. The truth was that nobody knew what was happening. Not Celine, not her doctors, not the people closest to her. So there were gripes. There were episodes of laryngitis. There was exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that a woman who had been performing at the highest level for 3 decades was entirely entitled to claim, and that the public was entirely disposed to accept because it was plausible, and because the alternative, that something was genuinely, deeply, mysteriously wrong, was not a story anyone wanted to tell without evidence to support it. The word that the plan attached to this period is deliberate and precise: lies. But it is essential to understand what kind of lies they were. They were not lies told out of contempt for the audience. They were not lies told to protect a brand at the expense of honesty. They were lies told out of terror. The specific terror of a woman who stood in front of hundreds of thousands of people every year and could not offer them a single truthful sentence about what was happening to her, because she did not have one. You cannot explain a diagnosis you do not have. You cannot describe a disease that has not yet been named. All you can do in that situation is find the most plausible available word and offer it in place of the silence that the truth would require. The Courage World Tour was announced in 2019. It was Celine's first major world tour in over a decade, and the ambition behind it was enormous. 156 shows across North America and Europe, beginning in September of 2019. The North American leg began as planned. The European leg was scheduled to begin in 2020. And then the pandemic arrived, and the world stopped, and the tour was suspended along with every other large-scale live event on the planet. For Céline Dion, the pandemic pause was different from what it was for most artists. For most artists, the pause was an enforced interruption of a functioning career. Frustrating, financially damaging, but temporary. For Céline, the pause landed on top of a body that was already deep into a process of deterioration that nobody had yet named. The symptoms that had been accumulating since 2005 were not waiting for the pandemic to end. They were progressing. The rigidity was progressing. The spasms were progressing. The capacity to perform, to stand on a stage and do the thing she had done for 50 years, was eroding in ways that the pandemic had not caused, and the pandemic's end would not reverse. In August of 2022, Céline Dion received a diagnosis. The condition was identified as stiff person syndrome, a neurological autoimmune disorder of extraordinary rarity, affecting approximately 1 in every 1 million people. Stiff person syndrome causes progressive muscular rigidity and severe painful muscle spasms that primarily affect the trunk, the limbs, and, in ways particularly devastating for a singer, the respiratory musculature that controls the voice. The immune system, in a process that medical science does not yet fully understand, begins to attack the nervous system itself, producing a rigidity that is not metaphorical and not psychological and not the product of stress or overwork or insufficient rest. It is neurological, it is autoimmune, it is real, and it has no cure. The diagnosis arrived 17 years after the first symptoms. 17 years during which Céline Dion had stood in front of the world and offered it whatever word she had available: flu, laryngitis, exhaustion, fatigue. Because the word that would have been accurate did not exist yet in her vocabulary or her medical record. 17 years of not knowing. 17 years of being terrified in a way she could not explain, because the explanation required a name she did not yet have. In December of 2022, she posted a video on Instagram. She sat in front of the camera and she told the truth. She said, "It's been really difficult for me to face these challenges and to talk about everything that I've been going through." She described the diagnosis. She described what the disease was doing to her body. She described what it meant for her ability to perform. She was crying. The world, watching, understood for the first time that the gripes and the laryngitis and the exhaustion had never been the real story, and that the real story was far more serious and far more frightening and far more human than any of the invented explanations had been. What do you do with 17 years of fear once you finally have a name for what caused it? There is a scene in the documentary I Am Céline Dion that lasts 17 minutes. It was filmed during a rehearsal session. Céline Dion is working, doing what she has done for 50 years, preparing her body and her voice for a performance, when the spasms begin. They begin the way they always begin, without warning, without the courtesy of a prelude that might allow the people around her to prepare. And then, within seconds, her body is no longer under her control. The rigidity spreads through her torso. Her limbs lock. She cannot move. She cannot breathe normally. She is conscious, aware of everything happening around her, aware of the medical team that surrounds her immediately, aware of the cameras still rolling. But she is trapped inside a body that has temporarily ceased to respond to any instruction she gives it. The spasm lasts 17 minutes. 17 minutes of total muscular seizure, during which the woman who sang at the closing ceremony of the Atlanta Olympics, who filled the Stade de France, who performed My Heart Will Go On to an audience of 1 billion people, lay motionless on a rehearsal room floor while her team worked to bring her back. The documentary I Am Céline Dion was directed by Irene Taylor and released on Amazon Prime Video in June of 2024. It was not a conventional music documentary. It was not a career retrospective organized around archive footage and talking head interviews with people who admired her from a distance. It was something far more difficult and far more necessary. An unflinching examination of what stiff person syndrome actually does to a human body, filmed in real time, with a subject who had made the decision that the world needed to see the reality rather than the managed version of it. The decision to include the spasm footage was Céline's. She understood what it would mean, understood that the image of Céline Dion motionless on a rehearsal floor would become the image that the documentary was remembered for, understood that it would be replicated and discussed and analyzed in ways that went far beyond any promotional context she could control. She included it anyway, Because she wanted people to understand, not to generate sympathy and not to generate headlines, but because stiff person syndrome is a disease that most people have never heard of. And the gap between the name and the reality is so vast that words alone are insufficient to close it. The footage closes it. You watch it, and you understand, not intellectually, but physically, in the involuntary tightening of your own chest, what the disease actually is. The critical response to the documentary was immediate and overwhelming. Reviewers who had spent careers watching music documentaries said they had never seen anything like the spasm scene. They said it was one of the most devastating sequences ever included in a documentary of any kind. They said it recontextualized everything. Every cancelled concert, every invented explanation, every public appearance in which Celine had seemed slightly diminished from the version of herself the world expected. All of it, in 17 minutes of footage, became comprehensible in a way it had not been before. Before the premiere, on the red carpet in Los Angeles, a reporter asked Celine how she was feeling. She looked at the camera and said, "I'm not dead." 3 words, delivered with the particular precision of a woman who understood exactly what she was saying and exactly why it needed to be said. She was not being flippant. She was not being dramatic. She was making a statement of fact that doubled as a declaration of intention. A refusal, delivered in the most compressed form available, to allow the disease to become the defining noun of her existence. The treatment for stiff person syndrome is aggressive and ongoing. There is no medication that reverses the condition. The immune system's attack on the nervous system cannot be stopped, only managed. The management involves intravenous immunoglobulin therapy, muscle relaxants, anti-anxiety medications that reduce the neurological signals that trigger the spasms, and physical therapy to maintain whatever range of movement the disease has not yet claimed. It is not a treatment protocol that looks like recovery in any conventional sense. It looks like maintenance. It looks like negotiation. A daily, exhausting negotiation between what the body will allow and what the person inside the body is determined to do regardless. Céline Dion has been inside that negotiation every day since the diagnosis. And in the middle of that negotiation, in the middle of the intravenous therapy, and the spasm management and the physical therapy, and the careful incremental effort to rebuild whatever the disease had taken, she made a decision. She was going to sing again. Not because the disease was retreating, not because the medical team had delivered a prognosis that made it safe, but because the alternative, the version of her life in which the disease became the last word, was not a version she was willing to inhabit. In March of 2025, she posted a video on Instagram. She was dancing. She was playing golf with her 3 sons, René Charles, 23 years old at the time, and the twins Nelson and Eddie, 14. She looked like a woman who was not performing wellness for the camera, but who was, in some genuine and hard-won way, experiencing it. The comments section filled within minutes. The observation that appeared most frequently, in dozens of languages, was a version of the same thing. She looked like herself again. In May of 2025, she appeared at the Eurovision Song Contest semifinals in Basel, Switzerland, in a pre-recorded video message. A callback, 57 years after she had stood on a Eurovision stage in Dublin and won. The appearance was brief. It was not a performance, but it was presence. The deliberate public assertion of a woman who was still here, still engaged, still paying attention to the world that had been paying attention to her for 5 decades. And through all of it, the treatment, the documentary, the Instagram videos, the Eurovision appearance. One date was being held in reserve. One city was being held in reserve. Because there was something unfinished in Paris, Something that had begun in the rain, at the top of the most famous tower in the world, in July of 2024, that needed a proper stage to complete it. What happens when a woman who was never supposed to sing again decides that the disease does not get to write the ending? The opening ceremony of the Paris Olympic Games on the 26th of July, 2024, was designed to be unlike any opening ceremony in the history of the modern Games. Instead of a stadium, the city itself became the venue. Athletes traveling by boat along the Seine River, past monuments and bridges, and crowds of 300,000 people standing in the rain on both banks of the river. While the ceremony unfolded across the entire length of the city, it was audacious in its ambition, and chaotic in its execution, and beautiful in the specific way that only events too large to fully control can be beautiful. The ceremony's creative directors had planned a closing sequence that would anchor everything that had come before it. The sequence would end at the Eiffel Tower, the most recognizable structure in France, possibly the most recognizable structure in the world. With a performance of Hymne à l'amour, the song Edith Piaf had written in 1949, as a declaration of love so absolute that it treated the destruction of the entire world as an acceptable price for its preservation. The song is one of the defining artifacts of French cultural identity. The performance needed a voice equal to what it carried. The identity of the performer had been kept secret until the moment of the performance itself. The ceremony's directors understood that the secret was the performance, that the revelation of who was standing at the top of the Eiffel Tower, in the rain, on that particular night, was itself the most important thing they had to give the audience. And then the camera found her, standing on the first level of the Eiffel Tower, in a white gown, in the rain, Céline Dion, a woman who, 2 years earlier, had been lying motionless on a rehearsal room floor for 17 minutes. A woman who had spent the previous 2 years in aggressive medical treatment for a disease that has no cure. A woman who had said, on a red carpet in Los Angeles, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had recently needed to remind themselves of the fact, "I'm not dead." She stood in the rain. She waited for the music. And then she sang. What followed was not a technically perfect vocal performance. Céline Dion, at 56 years old, in the middle of treatment for a progressive neurological disease, performing outdoors in the rain after years away from any stage, was not the same instrument that had recorded My Heart Will Go On in 1997. Nobody watching expected it to be what it was, what it became, in the 36 seconds between the first note and the moment the audience on both banks of the Seine understood what they were witnessing, was something that technical perfection cannot produce and cannot replicate. It was presence. It was survival made audible. It was a woman who had spent years being told, by her own body and by the medical reality of her condition, what she could not do, standing at the top of the most famous tower in the world and doing it anyway. The response was global and immediate. Social media filled within minutes, not with the ordinary commentary that surrounds a major cultural event, but with something closer to collective disbelief. People who had followed Celine's illness knew what it had cost her to stand there. People who had no knowledge of the illness at all heard something in the performance, some quality of need, some quality of urgency, that communicated the same information through sound alone. The broadcast was watched by an estimated 600 million people worldwide. In the hours following the ceremony, searches for Céline Dion increased by more than 1,200% across major search platforms. The French press called it the moment of the Games. Several international broadcasters called it one of the most emotionally significant live television moments of the decade. The specific consensus across languages, across cultures, across audiences who came to it with wildly different levels of prior knowledge about Céline Dion's medical situation, was that they had witnessed something that the ordinary vocabulary of entertainment coverage was not quite large enough to describe. It was not a comeback. Comebacks belong to artists who left and returned. Céline Dion had not left voluntarily. She had been taken by a disease she did not choose, in ways she did not understand, over a period of years during which she had done everything medically and personally possible to prevent it. What happened at the Eiffel Tower on the 26th of July, 2024, was not a comeback. It was a refusal. A public, rain-soaked, globally broadcast refusal to allow the disease to be the sentence that ended her story. And yet, and this is the thing that the performance at the Eiffel Tower also made undeniable, a single song at the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games is not a concert. It is not the same thing as standing on a stage for 2 hours, night after night, delivering the full physical and vocal demands that a proper Céline Dion concert has always required. The Eiffel Tower performance was proof of possibility. It was not proof of restoration. It was a declaration that the voice still existed, that somewhere inside a body fighting a disease with no cure, the instrument was still there, still capable of producing something that moved 600 million people simultaneously. But the question it raised, the question that every person who watched it and every journalist who wrote about it was implicitly asking, was whether what happened at the Eiffel Tower could be sustained. Whether it was a moment, or whether it was the beginning of something larger. September 2026 was going to answer that question. 10 concerts in Paris, not the Eiffel Tower in the rain, with the ceremony around her and the river below her and the entire machinery of the Olympic Games providing the context. Just a stage, just the lights, just Céline and the voice and the audience and the disease that would be present whether she named it or not. Because it is always present, and it always will be, and she has made her peace with the fact that the negotiation never ends. That was the answer she had chosen. Not to wait for a cure that the science cannot promise. Not to wait for a version of her body that the disease may never return to her. But to go back to Paris because it was always going to be Paris, and finish what the illness interrupted. There is a version of this story that ends with a cure, a version in which the medical team finds the precise combination of treatments that reverses the autoimmune cascade, restores the neurological pathways, returns the body to the state it occupied before 2005, before the spasms, before the rigidity, before the 17 years of symptoms that had no name. That version of the story would be simpler. It would be more satisfying in the conventional sense. It would give the audience the ending that the arc seems to demand. That is not this story. Stiff person syndrome has no cure. The treatments that Céline Dion has undergone, the intravenous immunoglobulin therapy, the muscle relaxants, the neurological management protocols, the physical rehabilitation, do not reverse the disease. They manage it. They negotiate with it. They create, on good days, enough space between the body and the disease for a person to inhabit something that resembles the life they had before. On bad days, they do not. The disease does not make promises, and it does not honor the ones that hope makes on its behalf. What Céline Dion is doing in September of 2026 is not the product of a cure. It is the product of a decision made by a woman who has spent 4 years learning, with extraordinary precision, exactly what her body will and will not allow, and who has determined, on the basis of that knowledge, that what it will allow is enough. Enough to stand on a stage. Enough to sing. Enough to give the audiences in Paris something real. Not the managed perfection of a voice at its absolute peak, but the genuine, hard-won, irreplaceable presence of a woman who refused to let the disease write the final line. The Paris La Défense Arena holds 40,000 people, 10 concerts, potentially 400,000 people who will walk into that building over the course of September and October 2026 and sit in the presence of one of the most extraordinary voices the popular music of the 20th century produced. A voice that exists now not in spite of everything it has been through, but because of it. The texture of what Céline Dion's voice carries in 2026 is not the texture it carried in 1997. It carries something additional now, something that cannot be taught, cannot be manufactured, cannot be produced by any amount of vocal training or studio engineering. It carries the specific weight of survival, the knowledge embedded in every note of what it cost to still be here. René Angelil heard something in a cassette tape from a 12-year-old girl in Charlemagne, Quebec, and mortgaged his house to bring it to the world. He spent the next 4 decades building the architecture of a career that would eventually reach 240 million records sold, 5 Grammy Awards, and a performance at the top of the Eiffel Tower that 600 million people watched in real time. He did not live to see the Paris concerts. He died on the 14th of January, 2016, 2 days before his 74th birthday, with Céline at his side. But the career he built, the infrastructure of global recognition, the reservoir of audience loyalty, the sheer accumulated weight of 50 years of extraordinary music, is precisely what makes September 2026 possible. The sold-out shows are his legacy as much as hers. The 400,000 people who will fill that arena are, in some sense, the answer to the bet he placed when he mailed a cassette back to a family in Charlemagne and said, "I heard something. I believe it. I am willing to stake everything I own on it." René Charles Dion, born in 2001, is 25 years old as his mother prepares to return to the stage. Nelson and Eddie, the twins born in 2010, are 16. They have grown up inside the specific reality of a mother who is simultaneously one of the most famous artists alive, and a woman managing a serious chronic illness, who has shown them, by the living example of her daily existence, what it looks like to negotiate with limitation without surrendering to it. The 3 boys who appear in the Instagram video from March of 2025, dancing, playing golf, moving through an ordinary afternoon with the uncomplicated ease of people who know they are loved, are the most important audience Céline Dion has ever performed for. Everything else is the world watching. They are the reason. She sang at the Eiffel Tower in the rain because she needed the world to know she was not dead. She is going back to Paris in September of 2026 because she needs to finish what the disease interrupted. Not to prove anything to the disease. The disease does not listen, and it does not care, and it will be there in the wings every night, regardless of what happens on the stage. But to prove something to herself, and to the 400,000 people who bought a ticket on the basis of a birthday announcement, and to the 12-year-old girl in Charlemagne who sent a cassette tape to a stranger and waited to find out if anyone heard what she had to say. Someone heard. The world heard. And on a stage in Paris in September of 2026, 58 years after she was born, the 14th child in a house that was never quite large enough, but always full of music, Céline Dion is going to open her mouth, and the voice is going to be there. And whatever it carries now, it will be enough. It was always going to be enough. If this story has moved you, if the image of a woman standing in the rain at the top of the Eiffel Tower, refusing to be the last word of her own story, has stayed with you. Leave a tribute for Celine Dion in the comments below. Tell us what her voice has meant to you. Tell us where you were when you first heard it, and what it did to you when you did. And if you believe that the stories worth telling are the ones that cost something to live, subscribe to Golden Fame News, because every week we bring you the full story. Not the version that fits the headline, the version that took a lifetime to write,